noches a todas y todos. Gracias por su paciencia. Estábamos en un curso de primeros auxilios. Y justo retomando este gran evento y sobre todo, en especial, muy contentos de recibir a dos grandes autoras en relación con esta gran presentación del libro, me complace presentarles, a nombre de nuestra señora directora, y por supuesto darles la más cordial de las bienvenidas, a Nadia Urbinati, una de las voces más influyentes y respetadas en el estudio del populismo, la representación democrática y la teoría política contemporánea. Nació en Italia, es doctora en Ciencias Políticas por el Instituto Universitario Europeo de Florencia, una de las instituciones académicas más prestigiosas de Europa. Desde hace años se desempeña como catedrática de Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad de Columbia, en Nueva York, una de las universidades más importantes del mundo, después de la nuestra, desde donde ha formado a generaciones de estudiantes e influido de manera decisiva en el debate académico global. Su obra ha renovado profundamente nuestra comprensión de la democracia representativa, la ciudadanía y las dinámicas del populismo, convirtiéndola en un referente indispensable para pensar los desafíos democráticos del presente. En reconocimiento a su trayectoria intelectual, en 2008, el presidente italiano Giorgio Napolitano la nombró comandante de la Orden del Mérito de la República Italiana, destacando su contribución al estudio de la democracia y la difusión del pensamiento liberal y democrático italiano en el extranjero. Hoy tenemos la enorme fortuna de escucharla y aprender de una de las muy grandes pensadoras democráticas de nuestro tiempo. Démosle, por favor, un muy fuerte. Pero no dejen de aplaudir, porque por supuesto que sienta Italia el calor de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y particularmente de sus estudiantes de Derecho mexicanos. Muy bien, estudiantes. Asimismo, también tengo el placer de presentarles a Cristina Lafont, nacida en Valencia, España, y reconocida como una de las filósofas políticas más importantes del mundo en el estudio de la democracia contemporánea. Se doctoró en filosofía en la Universidad de Frankfurt, donde fue discípula e intérprete de ni más ni menos, Jürgen Habermas, uno de los grandes pensadores del siglo XX y referente absoluto en teoría democrática. Esa formación marca profundamente su trabajo y su compromiso con una democracia basada en la deliberación, en la participación y en la fuerza pública de los argumentos. Actualmente es profesora en Northwestern University, una de las universidades más prestigiosas de Estados Unidos, después de la nuestra, y sus ideas han influido decisivamente en los debates globales sobre cómo revitalizar las democracias en tiempos de polarización, desinformación y desconfianza institucional. Cristina Lafont ha dedicado su carrera a una pregunta esencial. ¿Qué significa realmente que un pueblo se gobierne a sí mismo? En un contexto donde muchas personas sienten que la política ha dejado de escuchar, su trabajo ofrece una defensa clara, rigurosa y profundamente humana del papel central de la ciudadanía. Es una verdadera pensadora, valiente, lúcida y comprometida con la idea de que la democracia solo puede sobrevivir y fortalecerse si participamos, deliberamos y decidimos juntos y juntas. Hoy tenemos la fortuna de escucharla. Por favor, también un fuerte aplauso para ella.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación para venir a México y también por la introducción exagerada, obviamente, pero que está muy bien. Sí, vamos a hablar del tema de la democracia que nos apasiona. Me encantaría hablar en español, porque para eso soy española, pero para que, bueno, como hemos escrito un libro juntas, necesito que Nadia y yo necesitamos saber lo que estamos diciendo para no repetirnos. Entonces voy a hablar en inglés para que podamos seguir la conversación mejor. Pero muchísimas gracias por venir y espero las preguntas que tengáis sobre lo que vamos a discutir hoy. Y bueno, voy a empezar hablando del libro. Tiene un título muy raro y mucha gente no sabe lo que es la lottocracia y me parece fenomenal porque no es una buena idea en cualquier caso, pero para explicar un poco por qué escribimos el libro y por qué pensamos que es importante tener en cuenta el desafío de la lottocracia, hay que pensar en este momento de crisis de la democracia y el hecho de que la mayoría de los sistemas políticos se ven con una crisis de legitimidad por el hecho de que la ciudadanía piensa que la democracia les ha fallado. En todas las encuestas que se hacen sobre la crisis de la democracia y por qué la ciudadanía está descontenta, la razón fundamental... Ay, estoy hablando en español. I'm going to change to English. No, I know, but it's not fair. Okay, I'm not sure to English. So the reason they think there's a crisis of democracy is mainly because the political system does not respond to the needs, the interests, the values of the citizenship, right? Citizens don't feel that the political system is reactive to what they want, to what they think is important to their needs, their interests. Right? And when they are asked about what they think should happen, what will improve the situation, the thing that is at the top is that there should be an increase in citizen participation. That citizens need to be closer to the political system. They have to be able to influence it. Right? In that context, it's very interesting, fascinating actually, that over the last 40 years, a new type of institution has been played with, organized, designed, tried out many times, namely, but in general, technically it's called deliberative mini-publics. But most people know more about citizen assemblies because that is the model, is one of the models. There are others, but it's the better known. The one that was so successful, for example, in Ireland, they had several citizens' assemblies where they were able to change the constitution, amend the constitution with regard to liberalization of abortion and permission for same-sex marriage. So citizens' assemblies have been organized all over the world. All movements that are trying to influence policies on climate change think that citizens' assemblies is the future, is the way to go. Citizens' assemblies simply are organized with randomly selected ordinary citizens that get a chance to debate and deliberate with one another. They make sure that they have a diverse sample of citizens so that they represent roughly the citizenship in question, right? So they try to make sure that it's the type of diverse group that we usually do not get a chance to talk to. Usually we talk to people who are like us, people who share our characteristics that are in our geographical location, that share our profession. That is the way normally deliberation goes. In a citizens' assembly, people get for the first time to actually talk to people who are very different from them, that come from different walks of life, they have very different experiences, very different interests, etc. And the results have been fascinating. I actually do love citizens' assemblies, and this opportunity of improving the participation of citizens in policy making. The most fascinating thing, for example, has been to discover first that when citizens get together in a very diverse sample of people, actually they do not polarize, as other people have speculated it would happen, like Has Samstein famously wrote an article talking about the law of polarization and saying that it was very likely that if you force people to deliberate who have very different views, that they will kind of like polarize more, they will stick to the camps, right? They will feel more the contrast of the other views and will be actually receding to their own way, and that will polarize the population. Well, with all the citizens' assemblies that have been organized, even in experiments by academics in universities, etc., not the ones only that have political power, but the ones that they have tried just to see what the science best, etc., they have shown that people do not polarize to the opposite. They actually get to understand what matters to people who are very different from them, what problems they have. And the second thing that is fascinating really about citizens' assemblies is that they come up with much better solutions and ideas than what they were offered to, right? Normally, citizens' assemblies have been organized top-down by some kind of public authority or by the President of the Republic, like Macron, who was organizing very big citizens' assemblies in France, right? And they usually have some issue, topic, policy that they have to discuss that have been pre-selected by someone else, and they typically have a kind of menu of potential recommendations they can make. And again, it has been proven that when you put people, ordinary people, who really come from very different experiences, that have very different views, they are very creative. They come up with recommendations that they think are much better than the menu that they were offered by the public authorities, right, about what to do on anything, on climate change, on transportation. They come up with very new ideas, much better ones, that actually will solve problems in a better way that nobody had thought about. So those are features that are very interesting about citizens' assemblies, and that show kind of a potential of what could be done, how we could improve the political system by adding that type of experience, deliberation, input from citizens. So that sounds all very good. That has been going on for many years, but in the last 15 years, I would say, there has been a move from simply organizing those assemblies and seeing how to design them better, what works, what doesn't, all that kind of thing, to moving into actually trying to institutionalize them really permanently, not just a one-off thing, but really within the political system. That has been a movement that has been successful in Mongolia, for example. Now is in the constitution that you cannot have any kind of amendment of the constitution without organizing a deliberative vote, which is a model of deliberative republic. In Belgium, there are now already permanent citizens' assemblies that bring up issues to parliament, etc. So that is the next phase of that movement that has been going on for 40 years into actually really giving some kind of power to that type of institution in a kind of permanent way. Although, of course, we will always change the sample of people who participate, but the institution itself will be permanent. That is the phase where we are now. And reflecting that type of thinking and movement towards organizing citizens' assemblies, for example, one reason, the places where you see why citizens' assemblies are very special and very good is where you are thinking about policies that are kind of transnational in some way, or even global. That's why climate change is the movement that is asking for citizens' assemblies. Another context that you see that is in Europe, right? The problem you have in Europe is you don't have a European public sphere really, because there are so many languages, so many, like people cannot talk to one another, they don't understand each other, right? But you can organize a citizen assembly, bringing people from all different European countries to deliberate and show what they care about, what problems they have in their countries, right? You can do that globally too. It's very hard to have a global assembly of the whole world, but you can actually organize a decent citizen assembly with like 500 people from the whole world, and then get a sense of what do they think could be done on climate change or on anything. Okay, so that's what is driving this movement. And as always, when you try to organize something that is new, a lot of thinking is necessary, and that has produced a lot of interest among not only academics, but also academics, of course, into thinking how do we institutionalize this new innovation that is citizens' assemblies. And in that context, because the problem has been how to think about what will make it legitimate that these people that are randomly selected get to have some power, and how much power they ought to have and will be legitimate for them to have, right? That is a question. So a lot of scholars and academics on democratic theory have tried to work out and think about what will be the reasons, what will be the justification for giving power to people who are randomly selected. That means they are not elected by anybody. No one has talked to them to see what they are going to do or not do, right? We have no connection when something is by lottery, there is no connection between the rest of the people who will have to accept the decisions and those who are deciding. So it's not obvious why on earth, right, these people should have power. People who are like just won the lottery and then they get to decide things for everyone else and impose decisions on others. So in that process, what has recently released a very big debate on how to think about Lottocracy. Lottocracy is the name that has been given now by the most extreme proposal that is on the table, that is very unlikely to ever happen, but it's those who are defending that actually we should dismantle all kinds of electoral institutions. We should dismantle electoral democracy, so political parties, elected assemblies, the right to vote. All of that that we know and normally we understand as democracy, that should be dismantled and it should be replaced by actually ordinary citizens, assemblies, right, of people that are randomly elected. And there should be no political organization. In addition to that, no elections, nothing like that, right? This is what is called lottocracy.
Es lo que llamamos
and that is very extreme. We don't think lottocracy is going to happen anytime soon. We think it's a very bad idea on top of it, but it won't happen because you will need to change all the constitutions of the whole world.
Tenemos que cambiar todas
because in all constitutions, democratic constitutions, we know, remember, all the power comes from we, the people, as expressed in elections in which we all participate. So that makes it impossible to actually have a lottocracy under the current regime and the current constitutions, which I think is very good. Okay, the problem is not so much whether that radical change in political system is ever going to happen. The problem is the justification, what we call the Lottocratic mentality. The view that everybody is sharing who is involved in the movement of citizens' assemblies about representation, about the nature of politics, about the relationship between citizens and the political system, all of that is being rethought. And what is very interesting and worrisome at the same time is that for the first time, really, there is an alternative on the table of ways of thinking of something that they claim, the Lottocrats claim, is democratic, that really is not anything that we have seen before in the history of political thought. Like the alternatives to democracy have always been based on the idea that, for example, those who know are the ones that ought to rule, right? That's a very well-known option. You can call it technocratic, expertocratic, whatever, the rule of the wise or the knowledgeable or whatever you want to call it, right? That is as old as democracy itself. Plato already was in favor of having those who know really ruling and not those who are ignorant and don't know anything. That has been around forever, right? But what has never been going around is an idea of a model of rule by the few. Like in a citizen assembly, you may have 200 people, even 500 people. You cannot have a lot of people because they have to deliberate. And you cannot deliberate with, say, 300 million Americans in the US, right? You cannot do that. So you have to have representation, you have to have very few people. But then if you give them power to make decisions, to legislate for the rest of us, right? That is a form of rule by the few, right? And normally, that will be considered non-democratic because it rules out everyone else's who is not participating in making decisions. But they have come up with justifications with what we call the Lottocratic mentality that give that sense of why that would be actually democratic. In fact, the book that came out at the same time as ours from Alex Guerrero, Lottocracy, has as a subtitle, Democracy Without Elections. So when somebody like Plato or John Brennan say that the wise ought to rule, those who know ought to rule, and not the ignorant, they don't defend democracy. They just think democracy is a very bad idea, and that's why we shouldn't do democracy. We should do that those who know really actually rule. Okay. To claim that the few could be ruling and at the same time that would be a new form of democracy, that's really new. And it's a big challenge because it's convincing everybody that you can have democracy even though only the few actually decide things, right? And so the way they come up with this idea, well, first maybe perhaps a little bit about why that problem comes up on the ground. So the citizens' assemblies that have been organized, de facto, all of them have been top down. They have all been organized by some authority. Say Macron, the president of the republic, or some agency, like sometimes it's at the municipal level, for example, just to know what the people think about how to do garbage disposal. So you can organize an assembly for very little things in a very small place, or for national debates, or even global debates on climate change. Right? Okay. So the problem is that they have been organized for one time only, for a particular issue that have to be discussed with a particular menu of recommendations. And then because people don't know anything about citizens' assemblies so far, like in the example of Macron, he organized it because he wanted to pass legislation that was not popular. He got demonstrations, the yellow vest people on the street, like, not happy with the ideas that Macron has. And so he decided, oh, I'm going to organize a citizens' assembly, and that way I can blame the people for the tough decisions. They make the decisions, and I say, it's the people, what are you going to do? They want to do that, that will do. As it turns out, as always with citizens' assemblies, the people came up with very different ideas than what Macron wanted. And so since he didn't like it, he just ignored it and did not do any of the recommendations, although he had said that he was going to, at least in Parliament, discuss all the recommendations and decide many of them. He just ignored them. And no price was paid because people are not paying attention because they don't know what citizen assemblies are really. Although those were very prominent in France, still not everybody is paying attention. So you have here the problem that for people who have been organizing them very enthusiastic about the result, the fact that people really do understand very complex technical issues, the whole idea from the technocrats that ordinary people cannot understand anything because we are all ignorant, we don't know anything, turns out is not true, actually, because we have very special things. We are going to be affected, we bring in the interest, the needs, what happens to us, we have a lot of knowledge that the experts don't have because they don't live in our world. And so we do come up with interesting things and we do understand the issues, and it's fascinating to see that. So you make all these efforts and then the public authorities ignore you and nothing happens. So that is extremely frustrating. And so that is what has bring the movement towards thinking, no, we need to give some power to them. Because if an institution has no power, it can have no impact. That can be meaningful. And if it's not going to have any impact, then it's better if we just simply don't organize them because it's very expensive and the citizens get frustrated because they really put a lot of effort on it. Okay. So then they started thinking, as I was mentioning before, how much power to give to them. And the problem is that there is no natural place to stop. Because once you see that the problem is that they come up with ideas that are different than the menu, the problem is that, for example, in some cases they were like, no, what we need is to increase taxes. We need more revenue because then we can do this other transportation system that is actually solving the problem. That one that you propose is not going to do anything. Now that the experts told us, we understand, no, we want this other thing, so we need to increase taxes. But then the public authority will say, no, but we don't have authority over taxes, right? We are like whatever, municipality or something, right? It's like, no, we cannot do that. So then that's frustrating. They're like, no, if you want us to recommend something meaningful, we think that we should change something. So they want to be able to decide what to decide.
They don't tax the richest.
Right? They have to be able to say, no, but now, wherever the other ministry is the one that is relevant because we want to increase taxes. Let's tell them that they should do that, or let's step up. But of course, they don't have the authority to do that. So you see, the problem is if you want to, even if it's one issue only, want to give them the freedom to actually choose reasonably what the recommendation is, you have to allow them to decide what to decide on, right? So you move towards the sovereignty of parliaments, right? Parliaments have this authority to actually decide how and what to decide on. That way they can adapt, they can actually make decisions that are the best possible ones at the time. So then that's why you cannot stop at any other point about how much power to give to them because that you are constraining their ability to actually solve the problems. So there comes the idea of lottocracy. They should be legislative, they should have total powers to legislate. And even though the lottocrats are the extreme ones that propose to dismantle electoral democracy, most people in democratic theory these days love the other model that we discussed in the book, which is the complementary model. They say, oh no, we can have both worlds. We can have one chamber elected and the other randomly selected. You have a second chamber, like the Senate, depends on the structure of the particular country, right? You have these two systems together and then you get the best of both worlds. Of course, as we are in the book, the problem is, we think that we will get the worst of both worlds, actually, not the best, because the problem is that you are creating a tension here between two different sources of constituent power, right? The two chambers speak for the people because in one case is we, the people, elected them all together, right? And they are over-represented in that sense. And here, you get this second type of representation that is supposed to represent the people at exactly the same level and with the exact same legitimacy, right? They are the people too, right? And so then, if they disagree on something, who speaks for the people? Like, who has the final say? If you want to have a hybrid system, you have to be able to tell us who will have final say. Of course, if you decide that the real people are the randomly selected
anybody,
really, because the others are corrupt, because it's politicians, because of all the stories they tell us about why we should not have electoral democracy, if it's true that this is much more democratic, because this is people like us, right? Okay, they have final say.
Nadie habla por el pueblo.
Basically, because you have this other chamber that actually makes recommendations, but at the end of the day, the one that rules is the randomly selected. And if you decide, no, I don't want that, no, let's have the electoral chamber, actually assembly, have the final say, then you are into the model that we really think is great, which is that the other chamber, the other assembly, is making recommendations to the elected officials because they are the ones that speak in our name because we elected them, and that's what we wanted to happen, so to say. And then you are in the auxiliary model, which is the one that we think is the right one. We think that citizens' assemblies should never legislate, and the reason is because whether or not they are people like us, we have not been able to exercise the freedom of deciding what we want to happen politically. That's what we do in elections. In elections, we all together, collectively as equals, shape the political space for some years in a country within the types of parties and programs that are available. We just choose and say that many people want to go that way, the other want to go the other way, one social democratic, the other wants to be green, the other wants to be neoliberal, and then you get like the shape of the parliament, right, that tells you what we all together decided, because we have different views and we want different things, and depending on how many people wanted what, you have a party that is in the majority, the minority of the opposition party can be bigger or smaller. That's how we together decide the direction of the country, for good and for bad. We did it all together. If you randomly by lottery select some people and they decide the direction of the country by themselves, that really has nothing to do with us. Has nothing to do with democracy. We have no way to complain to them because they are really the usurpers. They are like us. They are so much like us that they really are supposed to decide like they do when we vote. When we vote, no, we don't have to be accountable to someone else. We decide exactly as we see fit. We decide alone, secret ballot. We decide which party we think will be better to vote for, right? For better or for worse. So no one can put constraints on how we vote, and no one can ask us for giving any kind of justification, right? Okay, well, if the randomly selected people are citizens like we are, right, they have to decide as they see fit. They don't have to give an account to anybody about why they decide that way, whether they like it or not. They are supposed to deliberate, to get informed, and just decide as they see fit. They have no accountability. They can have no accountability because they are ordinary citizens, right? Like we are. We don't have accountability. We shouldn't, because we are the most given power. So it's very problematic to have usurpers to actually decide as they see fit, and then we all have to live with the consequences whether we like it or not. And the idea that this is democratic is really based on a view of representation. That's the last thing I want to say, so that I can talk about other things. It's a populist view of representation. The idea is that you need to believe that in electoral democracy you have an elite of politicians that are really not the real people, right? They are the enemies of the people, the elites are the enemies of the people, but we, the people, are homogeneous. We all want the same thing. If it weren't for the politicians and if it weren't for the corruption and everything, we would all want the same thing. And that's why, if you have a sample that represents that these people like you, right, you don't need to decide because you can delegate to them, blindly trust them, because they are going to decide exactly as you do, because we are the people. We homogeneously have a view of the common good. And so that's why it's irrelevant who rules, right? Any sample, any random sample, will do the exact same thing, namely what we citizens want. You have to buy into the idea that we are politically homogeneous, that there is no pluralism, that people really don't disagree, that only we disagree because the politicians are an interest in polarizing us, right? But if it weren't for that, we would all be in agreement. They say so, in fact. That's the kind of argument they give. So they have this populist view that the reason why you will just simply go with whatever they decide is because they are people like you, right? That's the embodiment view of representation. And then the idea is that since the common good is clear, since we know what we want, right? And that's why it doesn't matter who rules, really, right? Then they have this kind of technocratic view of politics, right? The reason why we don't do it in referendum, because why not? I mean, if people like us, it's us. Why not us? Why don't we by referendum decide every single thing? Why not? Right? No, they don't like voting. They really are against electoral democracy. So no. The idea is that, no, you want a sample that has been filtered by giving them information by experts, being able to deliberate. So they do actually become better than us, right? Because they have this chance of knowing much better than we do. And that's why, if they decide, they will make better decisions than we do. Right? The problem with this form of technopopulism is that technocracy and populism don't really means well. Right? Typically, in the history of political thought, if you are a populist, you are not a technocrat, and vice versa. Right? Technocrats hate populists, obviously, because they want the expert to rule and not the people, right? And populists want the people to rule and zero the elites. I mean, no way. But typically, those views will be at each other's halls, right? But in this peculiarity of Lottocracy as a mentality, you get a form of technopopulism. You get a weird way of combining technocracy and populism that, as we argue in the book, the last thing I want to say, actually is unstable. It really doesn't work because it has two justifications that go against each other, right? Either you are arguing populistically that the reason why we should trust the decisions even when we disagree with them, right? Because in the end, citizens' assemblies also decide by majority rule. So there is a minority who has been informed, who has deliberated, and actually thinks the opposite, like humans in general, right? They are free, they'll come up with different ideas. So the reason why we should trust the decision even if we disagree with it is because they are people like us. And so we don't lose democratic control because they are going to decide exactly as we do. But then turns out, as it has been shown again and again in citizens' assemblies, that in fact, people in the citizens' assemblies change their minds often very drastically. That's why it's so interesting what happens in citizens' assemblies, right? Because they get informed about something we mostly are ignorant about a lot of things. When they get informed, they change their minds because they realize actually that's not a good idea, right? And with all the fake news, with all the manipulation in public debate, no wonder that happens. But that means that if you go technocratic, the reason why they should decide is not because they are like us. It's because they are better than us. It's because, like the famous, as always, view of experts, right? They should decide because they will make better decisions than we. And we will reap the benefits of the fact that those decisions were better. If they had decided what we wanted, we would have failed. The economy would have been a disaster, I don't know what technology, whatever. And so you reap the benefits of people being better than you. That is the traditional argument, but that is obviously incompatible with the idea that you don't lose democratic control. Of course you do. You do, and you should, because then you will be better off, in fact, not doing what you thought, because you are an ignorant. Okay, so you cannot have it both ways. It's either the populist or the technocratic justification, and both of them are not democratic. That's why we really disagree with it. So, leave it at that.
Because we are not ruling, they're ruling the world.
Me gustaría también dar las gracias a Andrea Posas, que representante de ICON que está aquí, y Nadia.
Eso sí lo entendiste.
¿Qué tal va la práctica de su listening? ¿Bien?
Yes.
Sigamos practicando. Pongamos atención. Gracias. I'm not getting. I cannot speak
Buonasera.
Spanish. I'm so sorry. I cannot speak your language, and for this reason, I use another language which is not my language, but I speak Italian.
Buonasera.
Better than English, but here we are. Now, in my presentation, I'd like to present the other part of the book, in which we try to give an argument on where this comes from. I mean, when this idea that we should embrace a different notion and practice of democracy comes from. This is an important question because all the theories that we mentioned, Elena Landemore, Alex Guerrero, Dowling, there are now several, not only a few, also somehow for different reasons are there. There are several authors who have an argument. Why? And when they have to answer why, they go back to the past. They go back to the ancient. So they make an argument, since that was the way the Athenians did, why not we? The Athenians, and so for us this is very important because it is an argument that has been transformed in a way that now is a mantra,
It is a kind of repetition, in which everything comes so easy. It's like a minestrone in which everything is very easily combined. And so we try to clarify something. Before arriving to this clarification, let me say that the reaching of the ancients comes from or after some steps, important steps to understand. First of all, starting with the 70s, and then until the end of the century, they discovered the ancient in order to contest, discuss, criticize, possibly substitute representation. These are three important authors that we refer to as fundamental to understand what is today the issue of lottery. Robert Dahl, Jon Elster, and Bernard Manin are crucial to understand that. Very important. But they are very different. So Dahl, in 1970, he wrote this important book called After Revolutions. He has 2 pages in which he discovers Athens and the lottery that they used to. And he says, look, we don't want to eliminate the principle of choice, meaning go to vote. Choice means I choose A instead of B or C or whatever. We don't want to do that. We don't want to substitute choice with chance. But sometimes it's important to recover this idea of chance. Because there are institutions in representative democracy, parliaments, Congress, parties, that they do all the job, and sometimes they do it in a discretionary way so that we really are not represented, even if they on these issues, on the other issues, think. So, issues are important. So the assemblies by lottery are not supposed to talk of everything, but on singular issues. Second, so of course, Dahl never thought of substituting, absolutely not. Elster, very important also. Jon Elster starts from a very different point. Elster starts from a point of anti-political. There is an antipathy for politics. Elster thinks, and I like to cite from it so you understand what I'm talking about. The main task is the reconciliation of honesty with the self-interest, something that elections cannot do because there is competition for power that defines that. Competition for power implies impossibility of impartiality and to combine together justice with interest. So interest win all the time with elections, right? So he goes to understand how it's possible to overcome this problem. And he goes to not Athens, it's very smart, not Athens, but to the Florentine Republic. And he has a fabulous analysis. He picks up from this analysis from Leonardo Bruni, so from the sources. Not from Machiavelli or whichever, but doesn't matter. So he goes there to see why it was possible for a while to combine together elections and lottery. He doesn't go to analyze Venice. This would be more interesting. But Venice, of course, is an oligarchy. He wants to present sortition as something democratic. So he wants to go to Florence, right? But lottery was used by non-democratic republics much more than by democratic ones. Doesn't matter. So he analyzed Florence and he shows that it is impossible to keep together the two. They were not able to do so. And the reason for that, it was that Florence, he says, it was already a modern society. Meaning it was based on interest, a market kind of society, based on the beginning of capitalism, we would say, that is bourgeois interest. At that point, elections would work better than sortition. The question is that they didn't have a constitution. And they didn't have a system of, I would add, they didn't, a system of legal equality that would allow elections to make the game of stability of interest. They couldn't make stability of interest because it was a society that was corporate. There were the guilds, but they were not individuals voting one by one. They were individuals voting within their own guilds. At that point, elections could not work because every time a group, a banker, an oligarch won elections, he used the victory in order to eliminate, to destroy, to crush down the opposition. So elections work if you have equal opportunity, equal to all, basic equality, not substantive equality, equal rights to compete, right? Very important. From this, Manin picks up. Manin starts from here, and he picks up another important intuition coming from Elster, which is not an intuition, it's a very important analysis that he makes. As he says, democracy based on lottery is based on a different conception of equality, not equality under the law or equality of opportunity. You understand why? Equality of opportunity, you start equal, you end up unequal, right? Most of the time. So not is another kind of equality of probability. And then he closes the parentheses. He doesn't go to analyze the probability stuff. Manin picks up from here. Manin starts precisely with that. And this, I think, the contribution of Manin is spectacular in my view, in good and bad, but it's fantastic, important. You have to read that book. It's crucial. Why is crucial? Because it makes an important move. Now, until the 60s, the 70s of the previous century, the movement against electoral democracy or representative democracy was very strong. And it was based, from the left, leaving aside the fascists, I don't want even to talk about them, from the left, it was based on attack against representation in the name of participation and direct democracy. You know, Benjamin Barber's book on participatory democracy, which was based on his analysis of Switzerland, was based on that. Elections is a ruin of democracy. We want forms of direct democracy. What Bernard Manin does is the following. That French democratic participatory or participationist, their friend, you're making a great mistake, because democracy implies actually selection. It's not true that the democratic people in Athens, 4th century BC, they did everything by themselves, gone to the assembly, and the assembly was the absolute ruler. It's not true. There were institutions by selection. They used two kinds of selections, the Athenians, as we know. He used simply Aristotle. He doesn't use other sources. Aristotle, politics.
Two faces from the
Two
same.
sources. Elections, when they have to elect apical rulers, chief of the army, chief of the treasury. That is, elections selected the individual according to competence, according to salience. It was a selection of the one. But when the Athenians said to select groups of people, collective or committees, they didn't use elections. They used selections. Why? That is because according to them, equality was indeed the one that we said before, that is equality of probability. When we had to pick, to select the people to create a jury, a group of people, we want one thing. First, the impartiality of the system of selection. We don't want to have people fighting over, partisan views. Impartiality. Second, impartiality. Second, each citizen is not only equal in front of the law, but is completely indifferent one from the other one. They are all identical. They can do everything. I can judge in the jury. I can judge in the administration. All the citizens are capable of doing everything that the republic or the democracy wants them to do. So you cannot make selection according to their competence, their capabilities, because otherwise you would claim openly that this person is better than the other one. But this is not the case with democracy. So in my country, Beppe Grillo, five-star movement used to say one is one. One is one. You cannot choose according to salience. Now, what does it mean then? It means that democracy, according to Bernard Manin, ancient democracy, actually is a system of indirectness. It is a system of representation. Because there is, of course, the assembly, but the assembly they used to vote not very systematically, and not always. And in the 4th century, after the coup, they made some changes in the constitution made the rules, and they introduced some important organisms, the nomothetari, and they used a system of procedural selection of topics and persons called graphe paranamon, according to which practically they control a group of people, they selected a group of people who were supposed to control the assembly and the laws that they were making. And this group of people, like juries inside of the assembly, like a constitutional assembly, if you want to say so, inside of the assembly, it was selected by lottery. So, who decided at the end in Athens? The assembly? Not much. Instead, the decision was made by these juries, selected according to sortition. So, the outcome was fantastic. He said, look, democracy is a form of selection. Is not direct democracy from 0 to 100. No, there is one moment of direct democracy, but it's selection. The question is that is selections not through competition. It is selections not through election. It is selection through a blind, impartial, not, can I say, divisive way of picking people. And as you know, the Athenians were grandiose because they used to have, at the beginning of each year, in January, they create a big machine, fantastic machine they created in order to have the selection. They used to select people, 1,100 every year, and then they use them to put in the assemblies, right? Interestingly, we are in democracy after all, and this makes a lot of difference. Very interestingly, the Athenians, they were not imposed to enter in these elections by juries. They chose voluntarily. So they self-proposed themselves. They self-selected themselves. And they decided, yes, this year I will be here ready to be sorted, my name to be sorted. So there was a moment of voluntary, and then, why Manin says so? Manin says so to tell us that elections are not democratic. Only selection by lottery is democratic. Elections is an oligarchic system, or is a procedural according to which we make decisions that declare somebody superior, not simply different. Now, why he does so? Why he says so? Because he wants to defend not much democracy, but representative government. And he says at the end that representative government is a mixed government, in which the mixing is between elections creating a oligarchy, you know, the tradition of Michels and all the elitists is an oligarchy. Where is democracy? Democracy is outside of the institution. This is like the Federalists, like Madison, is outside of the institution, is making movements, creating press party if you want, creating debates, debating in the sphere of social. That is where democracy is. So democracy needs freedom of speech, yes. Democracy needs equal possibility of talk and organize, yes. But if we enter in the institution of the state, democracy is no longer there. There is a form of, call it oligarchy. And thus, democracy is organized so as to press against oligarchy. so as to control perhaps, but not to substitute for it. Now, at this point, you understand that our friends Lottocrat, and we call them Lottocrat on purpose, what they do is to pick up this fabulous analysis of Manin to make an important move that Manin would never make. Never. First move, we should eliminate elections or consider elections a reason, a source of partisan division, conflict, corruption, selection of an elite. This is what democracy is not. Second, they say, we can, since we have a system now, we have internet, we have artificial intelligence, we have all the possibility of having and creating a system based on selections by lottery. So, if we had election before, that was because we didn't have the means to choose without parties or the intermediation of elections. We didn't have, so we had large state space and a lot of people, populations. Both factors induced the constructor of representative government since the 18th century to choose elections. And they also chose it for another important reason. That is, Elena Lander is very clear on that. She picks up very here and there. She's very smart in selecting the readings and the quotings. She said, look, if you go back to see the Federalists, they all think that elections is a way to kick people off of the institutions. 63 Federalists, perhaps by Hamilton, not Madison. Well, what is elections? Is a way of pushing people outside of the assembly. So elections were indeed created as a way to solve and expel the masses or the people or democracy outside of the state. Precisely as Manin said. So if this is the case, those days, in the 18th century, the 19th century, there was no other way. But today, Elena Andermore wrote recently an article, which is now in academia, I think, is how to use artificial intelligence for the masses. So why do we need to have elections? Elections are anachronistic. Elections are the sign of the past. And moreover, as a sign of the past that justified an elite system that we call democracy, but democratic is not. So what they do is a huge movement. For this reason is a mentality. I'm sorry, but it's not enough to say this person, this author, the other author, the other author. It is a mentality that is very widespread. The mentality that elections are a second best for what we cannot have until now. Perhaps now we can have. This was the argument made by the Five Stars movement. Why we should have, when we have internet, we can have another kind of democracy without elections, right? So that is a huge process and a huge phenomenon. As Cristina would say, is much bigger than we think, although the theorists are trying to make the argument for that. They are trying to give them the ideology. They are trying to give them the ideology. And the ideology tells you, the ancients did it. The early modern republic tried to do, they made a mistake because they didn't have the system we do have. With our system, we can do and so on and so forth. The question is, my friends, Lottocrats, you are making a huge violation of history. Because the ancient great Athenians never used elections to contain, control, and make laws. I'm sorry, but it's wrong. And we go through the analysis of the text to understand this. And we also try to make the case, and there is a very interesting, actually, analysis now in a group of people inside of the ancient political theories concerning these issues. This is the following, very interesting. Are we really sure that sortition is only used or was only used by the Democrats. The first to use sortition were the aristocrats, my dear friends, not the Democrats. The Democrats adopted it. It was by the aristocrats. The first example you can have, you go to open the book, the Iliad, and you have it. The 10 kings of Greece. When they had to decide which of them, they are all kings, remember, all equal, identical. They cannot be chosen one superior to the other one. Now, when they have to choose the fighter or the against the actors, what they do? Sortition. They use sortition among them. Sortition for them, and that is the difference from the Democrats. That is the difference. Not because they didn't use sortition. No. They use sortition, the aristocrat, before the Democrat. It's the justification that is different. For the aristocrat, the justification is the will of God. I'm sorry, but it's exactly, chance is the will of God. We accept the will of God. We don't fight against it. We accept the outcome of this election. So, when Jaworski says that elections is a way of creating peace, kicking off those who rule, and creating a condition of peace, also selections is capable of doing so. Is God, is the decision of Fortuna. Right? What we can say against Fortuna? We accept the verdict of sortition. That is important. What the Athenians did, that is the Democrats, they gave an argument that is secular, we would say, secular, rationalistic. They would say, not because of God, absolutely, but because instead, all of us, we are involved in this war. So not a group of people like the aristocrat, but the entire community. So it is, we are responsible for a choice we make, even when the choice is by selection. So they claim to be a collective responsibility, and the collective responsibility means the sovereignty of them, and not of some. So the real difference is precisely the justification of, not because they didn't use selections by lottery among the aristocrats, they did. So what we have to understand is when selections was used by lottery and according to which criteria it was or philosophy it was used. That is the important issue that our friends, the Lottocrats, they don't consider. And they thus make a real kind of Wikipedia history of the ancients in order to make their own case. And they are very good in writing that, but we have to be very careful because this argument, which seems to be a banal argument for historians, is not at all an argument for historians. It is an argument for our time. The argument wants to make us believe that if until now we had the system that we did call democrat and is not, it is because we have been, fooled by those who wanted to rule with our consent, and then we didn't have the instrument to do it. So they go through the criticism of the right to vote, the criticism of universal suffrage, the criticism of parties, the criticism of representation, everything, in order to claim that the future is not there, is elsewhere. Now, listen, the great Hobbes, when he describes the state of nature, chapter 13 of the Revival, he described it so ugly, so terrible, so disgusting, miserable, short, that at the end, if you give up that liberty, you feel that you don't give up anything. Actually, it's much better not to have that liberty. That is the same logic that they use the Lottocracy. It is so terrible, that kind of system called electoral democracy, that creates an elite. They divide the power among themselves. They gave us the illusion we choose them, but in fact they monopolize our system of information, and at the end they shape our minds, and then, so if we give up that kind of what they call freedom of making a choice of elections, we don't renounce anything that is great. We renounce something that is very bad, actually. So who cares about going to election, right? So that is a very, very dangerous movement, in my view. So leaving aside all what we can say we like or not like, it's not a question of likeness here. It's a question of a logic. There is inside of, in our time, democracy now, there is such a dissatisfaction justifiable, such a disgrace in accepting to live in society that they are ruling in our name against our interest is so huge, the disgust to be evident, that of course, when you have somebody proposing you, I give you the solution for that, which is very easy. Everything comes from elections. The bad we have comes from elections. Because if the bad comes from there, why don't you give up? If we give up to it, we gain something. We don't give up anything. So elections is under the grill. Is grill here, is election. And thus, our friends, they have a very strange idea of elections, the one that comes from Manet. The elections is electing one. Elections is electing individuals. The idea of Manet comes from Aristotle, and Aristotle was talking about Pericles, of course, which was one. Indeed, it was not a party. In Athens didn't have a parliament, and for him it's irrelevant. Because in any case they didn't vote. So, but it's very important to understand that the elections, they don't elect one, they elect parliament, collective. So, elections is a way of organizing the decision-making process, the deliberative process, is a way of creating, along with the parliament, parties, movements, associations, everything. Now, suppose you don't have elections and you have only a system of lottery. And the great Esther understood it well, because he's a great mind. He said, well, I understand that, but I have to admit, because I'm an honest intellectual, I have to admit that there is a problem. Each election, each assembly, sorted by sortition, is like an absolute king. One after the other, one after the other. Each election is autonomous from the following one, and from the other one. There is no correlations among these assemblies. Each time is an absolute. So at this point, he says, we have a society that is totally disaggregated, made of individuals, silent individuals perhaps, and assemblies each one after the other one. So in this case, the great Tocqueville, he said, understood it before, a democracy of individualistic structure, and a sortition is an individualistic structure at the highest, doesn't allow for organizations and associations and conflicts and disagreements, organized disagreements, not individual disagreements. So, what do you have? How can you structure the society with this ocean of individuals? You structure the society through bureaucracy and through system of technocratic competence, because it's the only way to give the fabric of society after you transform the entire demos of millions into a, silent unit of assembly sort. So I think that the end is, if you imagine yourself what kind of democracy this would be, well, for me it's not a democracy, it's simply a system without politics. It is a system without conflict, it is a system without disagreements, compromises, it is a system and without politics at the end, because yes, of course there is corruption, we know. But friends, do you think that if you eliminate competition, you eliminate corruption? Forget about it. Because an assembly, as Cristina would say, an assembly of selected by lottery can be easily corrupted by anybody from outside. You can give money to them, why not? They are capable of giving money to big presidents of great republics. They give money to individuals, selected them. Perhaps, as Cristina says, actually they're even more exposed to corruption. For one person selected by lottery once in his life or her life, that would be a great opportunity to listen to great offers by lobbyists. So this is not a destruction of selection, of corruption. On the contrary. So it's a huge problem, or many others. But I want to finish with one, since you discussed, they told me 1 year about sortition. There is perhaps one new place in which sortition is crucial, in my view, which is justice. Popular juries right they have to be selected by sortition. I'm totally because sortition is based on impartiality. It wants impartiality. It doesn't want the attachment to the thing that you have to discuss. It's like pure virgin people. They are there, they don't know anything, and they don't have to have any connection with the object discussed. So I think that is the only place. Or, perhaps as Cristina was explaining before, helping auxiliary, but please, to substitute the entire system based on representative electoral democracy with something that we don't know. And it's very hard to call it politics or democracy in my view. It is something beyond, in my view, imagination. But it's not so, unfortunately. For this reason, we need to work on that.
Nadia, Cristina, on behalf of the law school of UNAM, we have some presents for you.
I have questions. We have questions.
Yes. What big a question then tomorrow?
So,
Molto bello.
Depends on the university.
Exactly what is
The Puma. Una Goya. México, Pumas, Universidad, Goya, Goya, cachun cachun rara, cachun cachun rara, Goya, Universidad.
O sea, no hubo preguntas. ¿Qué creen que no le entendimos?
Es que hubieras preguntado. El problema es de forma o de fondo o de materia. Porque estaban diciendo que no más era el procesal, pero yo creo que falta más lo material. Porque, o sea, las cuestiones de la forma pues tienen que ver, pero lo que está de trasfondo.
Síguele. Es lo que está en el trasfondo.
El trasfondo materialista. Porque es pura como materialista, ¿no?
Es una mamada. Nos somete a un poder omnímodo que se puede controlar más fácilmente. Porque con falta de organización.
A ver, hacer una pregunta.
Ya.
Esa de lotería. O sea, que los precios han por sorteo, que hay una igualdad.
Bueno, como ya vieron, no se abrió el espacio para las preguntas. Yo creo por la hora. Pues esta fue Nadia Urbinati y Cristina Lafont, que escribieron este libro Lottocratic Mentality. ¿Cómo es la segunda parte? Una forma de defender la democracia. Me pareció súper peligroso esto. Súper peligroso. Pero bueno, interesantísimo. Interesantísimo. Pues esta dificultad que tienen muchos compañeros de no saber inglés. Pero yo sí tenía una pregunta. Ahí interesante. Pero bueno, no se pudo. Nos vemos. Ahí subo el video a YouTube porque TikTok es demasiado grande.